right, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I see nodding heads. Good way to kick off the session. Super excited to be here. As AJ gave a great introduction, my name is Ariana Moon. I am the recruiting manager at Greenhouse. I am so excited to be joined today by these two wonderful recruiting data ops experts. So here we have Shane Noe, head of recruiting ops at Box, and here we have Nick Reyland joining us from Squarespace, head of recruiting ops as well. So let's get right into it. I hope you all are as excited to learn about data-driven hiring practices as I am. You can tell I'm really excited. Okay, so let's start off with some more formal introductions. So maybe starting off with you, Shane.
Sure.
I would love to hear a little bit more about your role at Box, as well as maybe the size of your recruiting team and the size of the org that you support.
Great. Yeah, well, it's a real pleasure to be here and amazed to see this showing. So really happy to see this topic has some interest. So at Box, we have a roughly an 80-person recruiting team. That's split into tech versus non-tech. We have a UR team, an exec team, my operations team, which includes candidate experience. My role at Box, I found that the head of recruiting operations role has a lot of variability from company to company. At Box, it's really three things. It is data, insights, and analytics, managing our tech stack and our budget. So I do a lot of vendor demos, kind of trying to find where the next big tool is, and then owning the candidate experience and managing a team of coordinators. So yeah, that's sort of
That's a lot of functions to be in charge of. Great, very excited to learn more. Nick, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your role at Squarespace, as well as the size of your team, the teams you support.
Yeah, first, thank you for having me. Big fan of Greenhouse. And just a really quick shout out, Shane and I have actually been connected in the past. When I was working on a model, I reached out to Greenhouse and asked, hey, do you have any customers that have done this before? And they introduced us, and so it was really cool to work with him offline, but now in person. And so I work at Squarespace. I've been there for almost 3 years. And when I joined, the recruiting team was about 12 people, and a people department about the size of 25. Today, we are a recruiting team of 30 people and about 70 in our department. So I've got to see pretty much the department and company grow pretty significantly. I manage a team that sits outside of recruiting. We manage all the HR software that touches employment data, and we do workforce analytics and recruiting analytics using that data.
Great, thank you so much for that insight. Okay, let's dig a little bit into how you like to think about data. So I want to start from a little bit more of a high-level perspective on key best practices. So let's go to you, Nick. As someone who lives and breathes data on a daily basis and works with it, what would you say are key kind of high-level best practices that you would share about how to use data effectively?
Yeah, as someone who lives, I think we're going to say the word data a lot here. As someone who lives and breathes this day in and day out, I think that one of my North Stars here is data supports a movement, but it doesn't lead it. And what I mean by that is we can measure a lot in this space right now. It's a pretty popular space. But we can't measure things like human intuition or human experience. And so those things are things that we use with data to actually drive decisions. The second thing is there's a lot of things we can measure, right? There's so many metrics. If you just Google recruiting metrics, you're going to get tons of websites that talk about this. But it's knowing what measures what and when to use it. A great example of that is if you're managing a grocery store and you're hiring a bunch of cashiers, time to hire, which is when someone applies to when they get hired, is probably less impactful to your business than time of vacancy. You care more about how long has that role been open and how does that affect our bottom dollar. So knowing when to use which metric is way more impactful than just measuring it.
Yeah, that's definitely a really great way to think about that. I also like what you said about data is important to pair together with that kind of more human side of things. As someone in recruiting, I think this is something that we all encounter. There's a lot of great metrics. Sometimes it's hard to know which ones to use when, and like pairing it with the human intuition side is also a great thing. Shane, what about you? If you were to think of key best practices around using data effectively, what comes to mind?
Yeah, so I would second the 2 points that Nick made. But on top of that, I think there's 3 other considerations that I'd mention. One is your data is only going to be as good as it is accurate. So, we're all on different parts of our data journey, and at any point in time, usually at the beginning preferably, you want to really start to develop an understanding of where your data is accurate, where your data is not accurate. I'll give you an example. We had, when we first started getting serious about monitoring time and stage, we noticed that our time in the offer stage was 2 weeks in some groups, and we couldn't figure out why it would take a candidate 2 weeks to sign an offer. Turns out that it was just our process. Our recruiters weren't marking folks as hired in Greenhouse as fast as they should have been. So understanding the underlying process that is driving your data is really, really critical. The second piece I'd say is data is only valuable if people have it. So it's really important to democratize your data. This is actually hand in hand with data integrity, because once you start showing and using the data, your recruiters will start scratching their heads as to why that hire wasn't mentioned in that leaderboard, or why that my time and stage looks really, really long. So the two are kind of tied together a little bit. And the third thing I would say is, just echoing what Nick said, data is really only half the story. You can't run a team only on data. The data will flag areas that you need to go talk to your frontline recruiters about, but it's really, really important to just understand that the goal of data is to flag where you need to have conversations.
Right, awesome. I really like what you said about democratizing the data and empowering the recruiters to be good users of it themselves so that they can measure their own success. That's awesome.
That's it.
Okay.
Just to add to that,
Yeah.
there's a really old saying that bad data in is bad data out, and it's so true.
Yeah.
Yes, have to agree with that one. So we talked a little bit high level in terms of key best practices. I want to get a little bit more specific to make it relevant to the day-to-days of our business leaders here as well as our talent professionals here. So I'm sure a lot of us here in this room often are tasked with doing way too many things with way too little time. And in order to tackle that challenge, one of the things that recruiting leaders need to do is figure out what size or structure of a recruiting team they need to recruit for themselves to support the business. So on that theme, I would love to hear about how both of you have gone about capacity modeling and headcount forecasting for your own recruiting teams in order to support the business need that you're confronted with. So Shane, let's start off with you. I know you have some pretty cool ideas on this.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so this is great timing. So I gave a talk about a month ago at the ERE Media Conference on a step-by-step how to construct a cost per hire and capacity model. And so what I wanted to do was just take a subset of those slides to give you guys a high level. At the end of this section, there's a link if you want the full 40-page step-by-step on how to do this. But in general, capacity modeling, so prior to this role, my entire career has been spent in finance and strategy and analytics. I came over to Box originally in a finance and strategy capacity, and the most important input that I got from recruiting was the capacity model, because at the end of the day, our teams can't deliver if they're not staffed, and if I don't have a good understanding as to how quickly we can staff each team, you're really not helping the rest of the business. So I think this is really, really important. I think if you get this right, you get a B- in recruiting ops, automatically.
Okay, I'll take it, B-.
So I just want to go through 4 real quick steps, but this is how we think about capacity modeling at Box. So it starts by understanding where your recruiters and sourcers are spending their time. And for simplicity's sake, I'm considering recruiters and sourcers each to kind of be one recruiting unit. In practice, you'll have full stack recruiters, you'll have pure sourcers, and everywhere in the middle. For simplicity's sake, in your first stab at your model, you should probably consider them to be one resource. So the first thing to do is to figure out how they've spent their time historically. So what I'm showing here on the screen is a graph where I've got a handful of recruiters, Kate, Lauren, Ted, Amy, Eric. All the data you're going to see today is fake. But we've asked them to go back and figure out how did they split their time between the groups we want to report on. So if I take like Kate, for example, in Q1 of 2018, she spent 50% of her time supporting sales and marketing and 50% of her time supporting G&A. And by Q4, that switched to 60-40. It's important to note that we want to capture the time spent, the input, not necessarily how many starts or how many signs they got or how many hires they got out of that time. So if we can go to the next slide. So once you have that map of sort of all of the fractions of time across all your recruiters and how they've been spending it, you can summarize by group and get to this view, which is really showing the full-time equivalent number of recruiters supporting each group. So if I look at like US, the sales and marketing breakout there, in Q1 I had 3.75 recruiters on average supporting that group, and by Q4 that was 4.6 recruiters on average. So this is one of your components in figuring out your historical productivity. If we go to the next slide, I'll show you how this kind of ties in. So there's 3 boxes here, A, B, and C. In column A, I'm showing the number of signs. I want to just make a quick side note. At Box, we talk specifically about signs or starts. We've tried to eliminate the word hires because it's kind of nebulous. Are you talking about people who started in quarter, or are you talking about people who signed a contract in quarter? For the purpose of capacity modeling, it's better to use signs if you have reliable data. At Box, we actually use starts because we're still making sure that our signs data is very accurate.
And by signs, signatures of people signing offers.
That's right.
Great.
And sometimes the greenhouse data isn't as accurate as the workday data, where we know exactly when everybody started. So in our first iterations, we've used starts, and we've been slowly incorporating signs. Anyway, so I'm getting a little bit off track. So column A is signs. So you basically sum up, how many hires your team produced for the quarter. And you can see in Q1 we had 151 in total. In Q4, 159. Again, this is fake data. In column B, that second box in the middle, we've taken the summary from that previous page where we're showing how many full-time equivalent recruiters we have working for each group. And then to get to your historical productivity, it's just A divided by B. And so you can see in that productivity column, you get a sense for seasonality. It's really good if you can go back and do this 2 years so you can see if the dips and the pluses you're seeing are season-based. And you can see it's very different by group. This also kind of gives you your first hint at how much more difficult it is to hire engineers versus general and administrative. So this is kind of the first step. Now the next step is taking this and applying this forward. So if we go to the last slide of this section. So you take that productivity box from your previous slide. So that first box is what we just calculated. And then you want to forecast how many recruiters and sourcers you'll have supporting each group in the year going forward. From there, it's just multiplication. You take your productivity, multiply it by the expected number of recruiters, and that is your first capacity model. A couple notes I'd make on here. So again, at this point, we're only counting recruiters and sourcers. We're only talking about volume-based headcount. And you also probably don't want to model your capacity at 100%. We typically use about 85%. We'll plan to 85% capacity to give us some buffer in case there's additional headcount or a big spike in attrition that we have to address within quarter. I think that's it for my slides.
Smart.
Awesome.
And here's the link to the full step-by-step if you guys are interested.
Yeah, this presentation, Shane shared it with me before our session today, and I was just blown away with how thorough the thinking behind it was. So I encourage everyone here in this room to check out this link. It's some pretty cool stuff.
One note on that.
Yes.
That middle number at the end is actually an I before the 49.
Okay.
I got
Note,
some
it's
confusion.
an I.
It's an I, not an L.
Not an L. Okay, great. Nick, let's go to you to talk a little bit about how you think about capacity modeling at Squarespace.
Yeah, so when I think about capacity modeling, I think before I even dive into that, so my team, we operate actually like an engineering team, which means we practice Scrum and we build pretty much anything that we ship in versions. And why we do this is it's okay, like you're never gonna get to your year 5 version in year 1, but you need to help the business, right? You need to move things along. And so we iterate, and we iterate in versions. So when I started at Squarespace, I actually started in September, and they said, hey, next year we want to go hire 50 people. And I was like, cool, your team did that last year, we don't really need a model. And then in December, they're like, that 50 turned into 300. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I needed to put together a very basic model to get us off the ground and help our finance team. And so what I did was I looked at how many hires did we make, divided by number of recruiters, very similar to like Shane's in a very basic format. And that got us a really rough estimate. That helped our finance team plan for that next year, and it pretty much gave me another year to improve that model. So we moved on to V2, and V2, actually, we stole a little bit from our Scrum methodology. And in Scrum, you assign story points. And so story points are, for us, how many hours does each individual piece of work, do we think it'll take us to do? Does it take 1 hour or 5 hours? And so we applied that same idea into difficulty for each role. So I took a look back for the last 2 years, and I actually worked with each recruiter, and I said, cool, on a scale of 1 to 4, how difficult was this hire? Half of our company at that time was customer service reps, and so that was something we could pretty much do in our sleep. And so that was a 1. A 4 was something that would take us a quarter, maybe 2 to hire. A director level, if you're thinking, probably an SRE these days. And so for us, that was our calibration. And we took those points and divided by number of recruiters to get us how many point values can we do. And we're actually able to do it by quarter and by recruiter. The great improvement on that was it actually gave us the ability to look at what was the ask from the company the next year. So for example, if we can only do 100 points a quarter, and the company was saying, hey, Q1, we're asking 190, we're like, that's almost going to be impossible, right? Can we offload some of these hires into the future quarters that only have 60? How can we actually load balance a little bit better? But it also gave us the ammunition to say, hey, if we need 190 points, we need this many people to do that. So that was a big improvement. Now, I said earlier, our people department grew from 25 to 70, which is pretty significant. Our company's grown that way too. So when we iterated on V3, we also, our sourcing and our recruiting strategies changed a little bit. Instead of looking for applications, we actually had to go out in the world and start sourcing more. And so having a new sourcing model for our recruiting team, we wanted to actually look at how much physical work does each recruiter have to do to make the hires that we need. And so V3 actually borrowed a little bit from V2 in the same methodology, but it helped us be a lot more accurate in saying, this is how many hours of work this would require to go do this, and this is how many hours people can do.
Awesome. That must be validating that V3 had similarities to V2.
Yes.
Is there V4 in progress?
V3 is still a work in progress.
V3 is still a work in
It is
progress.
our strategy for 2020.
Got it. Awesome stuff. All right, let's move on to another topic that I think is really relevant to all of us here. So I want to move into talking about how to use data effectively when it comes to our core recruiting processes. So let's say you staffed up the team, how do you make sure they're actually running recruiting processes that are effective? So I'm going to go first to you, Nick, back to you. Talk to me a little bit about what you do in terms of making sure that those processes for interviews are effective through data.
Yeah, so it's definitely a very important topic, right?
Yeah.
And so when I think about the core thing that your key indicator when you're looking at your actual funnels in your process, the number one thing, and I hope you hear this a lot, it's going to be pass-through rates. Pass-through rates tell you when things are working really well, when they're overly working, or they're not performing. And those are the things that are going to indicate if you have a lot of false positives or false negatives, meaning if you have a high conversion rate in the beginning, you're probably passing through really bad candidates and spending a lot of time. If you have low conversion, you're probably getting rid of some of the best people that you might want to hire. So when we look at that, we look at the actual conversion rates, and then we figure out where we think it's broken. And for us, again, my team, we think about software building. And software building sometimes moves a little slow, and that's on purpose because you make small changes and you observe. And you give enough time so you have enough data, and then you make another small change and you observe. I'd encourage you to think about it like this. When you're on a cruise ship, they're not very agile, right? They don't turn on a dime. They turn 1 or 2 degrees at a time. And you don't really see that change right away, but when you give enough distance or time or number of candidates in your funnel, you can look back and say, oh, wow, we're in a different course here. The same thing applies. People want to make a lot of changes to their funnels quickly, but you can't measure the change effectively that way. It's small changes over large periods of time.
Definitely enjoyed that analogy of the cruise ship. Next time I see a
ships.
cruise ship, it will spark recruiting data processes. Awesome. Cool. So I have a follow-up to that question. When it comes to maybe scaling for high volume recruiting, Nick, do you have thoughts on how to use data effectively for that?
Yes. So when we talk about scaling, here's a great example. So when I think about scaling, and I don't know how many people work for startups or companies that are growing, right? And do you hear the word scaling quite a lot, right? I know sometimes I have nightmares about that word. And so when I think about scaling, I think of 2 things. One, I think you got to keep it simple, right? As you introduce process, if it's difficult, people aren't going to adopt it. They're humans. And so keep it simple and make sure it's repeatable. Can you do this over and over? And so some of the ways that we've done that at Squarespace is in using Greenhouse for our processes is we decided on the same nomenclature for naming, like stages. When I came in, there was face-to-face, in-person, on-site, and people were like, oh, that's on-site. And they're like, you mean the on-site take-home? And you're like, no, I don't know, it's on-site. And so we decided to use the same nomenclature for across the company for these stages. The second thing is we created an order of operations. And so we had this basic idea of what is interviewing at Squarespace? What does that mean to us? What is that process that fits well with our company? And so we created that process, and we wanted to make sure, one, that it was still agile enough that if you wanted to go off process, you totally could, right? Every role is unique. But our order of operations, which you'll see on the left here is the available job stages, means that every job follows from top to bottom. And that helped us with improving our recruiting, like the actual metrics, combining pipelines. Since everything flowed from top to bottom, it made it really, really easy. And so what you see up here is a really common job that we have. And this is pretty much our basic structure. And on the next slide, you'll see what an intern job looks like. And so the big takeaway here is, again, no matter what stage you're using, you're putting them in the same order to help with the actual analytics. And then on the last one is a really uncommon job. And so this may look really scary, and honestly, it's probably a really bad idea when we do it internally. But it's one of those, oh, this is a new job that we're hiring for. We've never done it before. What do we think that process should look like? And then how do we improve that over time?
Got it. So all of the searches that you run at Squarespace fall into one of these three categories?
No, they can use any of the available job stages in that order.
In that order. Okay, got it. Very cool. Shane, I know you had a really cool tidbit going back to what Nick was saying about pass-through rates.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts I'd share on pass-through rates. I agree with Nick that this is probably one of the first areas for you to start once you have your capacity modeling down.
We love capacity modeling.
Yeah, we love capacity. So what I'd say about that is, the original question I think was how can you use data to improve your process? One area that we've done this with respect to pass-through rates is eliminating stages that aren't filtering anybody out. So I'll give you an example. In our sales team, they got a little bit off track of our kind of standard process and added a pre-onsite stage, which is basically just a phone call before the onsite. But we saw that this had a 95% pass-through rate. So we're adding time to the interview process, which means, in general, the longer it takes, the less likely you are to close the candidate. And we're not actually filtering anybody out in that stage. Right. So we've been eliminating that stage, albeit very slowly, because there's been some resistance from the business. Yeah. So that's one piece. I think the other two things I'd say about pass-through rates with respect to metrics is I think it's easy to get really hung up worrying a lot about kind of the middle section of your pass-through rates. And as Nick mentioned, this is really just a trade-off between how many false negatives and false positives you're willing to accept. To just elaborate on what Nick said, I would say the candidate pool is really important in deciding what your ideal pass-through rates are. So if you go back to the example Nick gave, if you have a really small candidate pool, it would behoove you to let more of them through so that you have a higher chance of finding your candidate, even if that's wasting some time of the interviewers. Conversely, if you have a really big candidate pool, you can afford to be really strict up front and be really efficient in your interviewers' time.
Right, that's a great point around just using data in a way that's most effective for the right context. Yeah,
so the two other things I would say about pass-through rates, I think the two that I look at, because I think they're the most actionable. The first one is the offer acceptance rate. So we have an example, one of our teams, our engineering team at Box, we increased our offer acceptance rate from 50 to 75% just by focusing more on selling. I think the offer acceptance rate tells you if that's low, if that's below 60%, if that's below 70%, it tells you you're not selling enough in your process. Your folks are too focused on screening people out and not focused enough on selling them on the job. So I really like that one because it's very, very actionable. The other one that I like, and I usually like looking at this at the beginning of a search, is the hiring manager screen pass-through rate. Because that really tells you about the alignment between your hiring manager and your recruiter.
Right.
And if you catch a really low pass-through rate up front and you have that subsequent meeting to realign on calibration, it'll save you a lot of time in the process.
That's some great tips there.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we talked a lot about using data effectively for recruiting itself, like capacity modeling, headcount forecasting, making sure we have a great process. I would love to now dig a little bit into how we use data when it comes to partnerships with teams outside of recruiting. So still internal to the organization, but maybe with the departments that you're supporting in recruiting. So Shane, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about how you've used data effectively in order to communicate effectively with your hiring managers, your interview teams, your executives that you're working with.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to be hopping back to slide 3 for this.
I think it's slide 3, yeah. So I want to show flash a graph that I've found has a lot of traction at Box. So what we're showing here is the green bars represent the number of hires that we made in quarter. Let's call it starts. The gray bars represent plan, and the line graph represents the number of full-time equivalent recruiters and sourcers that we had on staff at the time. So I remember the reason I think this graph is so impactful is kind of coming from my finance background. I remember during plan, if recruiting doesn't have data, sometimes it feels like it's a black hole that you're just shoveling money into. And so by showing this graph, it actually helped us to build a lot of credibility because you can really see that if we invest in the resources, we can deliver the hires. So hopefully when you chart this out on your own, you'll notice that your capacity lines up with your delivery. If not, you might want to find a better view. So that's one piece. And then the last piece I would say is we think a lot about time and stage when it comes to effectively designing an interview process. And so this is part where we're really partnering with the business. If we see a big spike in time and stage, it can mean a couple of things. In some cases, it can mean if this is at hiring manager screen, it could mean maybe your hiring manager doesn't actually want to hire that person and they're delaying. It could mean that your panel's not big enough or the panel doesn't have enough availability. So if you're looking at these pass-through rates and you notice that, these time and stage numbers and you notice that something spikes, it prompts you to go figure out what's slowing down the process. Because again, the faster that we can get a candidate through, the more likely we are to close that candidate.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that. Nick, to you, talk to us a little bit about how you use data to communicate effectively with the hiring managers and execs you work with.
Yeah, so if you're anything like, from my experience in my companies that I've worked for, you come in and people either have a lot of data already and they've already solved this problem, they're communicating really well, or they're actually relying a lot on old relationships and trust and historical context to make those decisions. And when I see those environments, I always urge people to use good data. I know we said data a lot. And so when I think about data and talking and helping support teams, one of the things I think about is, and I've experienced this, I've made these mistakes, is inundating people with too much. Someone comes to you and says, hey, I want, what does this information show? And you're like, oh, our offer acceptance rate is 60%. And then their next question is, why? And you provided the thing that they asked for, but you didn't actually ever dig in to find out what the question was. And so using data effectively means you're answering the question, you're asking probing questions to figure out what's the right question that they're asking you. One of the ways that we do that at Squarespace is every employee has the opportunity to go through a class that we use. It's called Storytelling with Data. It's a website. It's exactly that, storytellingwithdata.com. There's a book. It's an external class that we found, and we educate our employees internally on how to talk about numbers, how to use graphs, what's the right situation and what measures what. That has put us all on the same page and allowed us to speak the same language when we talk about data.
That's awesome. I will definitely be typing that into my browser.
Yeah. I don't work
storytelling. What was it again?
Storytelling with Data.
Storytelling with Data. We should all remember that.
It's a really good resource.
Okay, excellent. Shane, now what about you?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to mention was we had talked a little bit about how you might use data to probe and figure out where there are problems in the business.
Yes.
And we have a really good example of a time that we've done this recently. In Q4 of last year, we had a pretty aggressive account executive hiring target, particularly in our field area, and we came up short. And if you can imagine, a company like Box, where we're meeting EPS by a penny each time, that's a really earnings per share. Sorry.
Thank you.
It's really important that we have our field sales organization completely staffed. And that can become kind of hard because in field, you have to have a specific territory for specific persons. You can't really have these evergreen recs that you have in other orgs. So the process that we went through to try to do a postmortem for this, I think, was fairly interesting. So we started by looking at the top of the funnel, and we said, the word from the ground was that we've been having a harder time getting interest in the roles. So we looked at our LinkedIn pass-through rates over time for the folks who were supporting field AE hiring, and sure enough, we saw that they had dropped. So that prompted us to kind of look at the messaging and figure out, is there more that we could be doing there in terms of messaging to maintain our higher pass-through, I'm sorry, I said pass-through rates, I meant to say response rates. So that was kind of where we started, and that was part of the cause. But it wasn't the full cause. So the next area we started looking at were hiring manager screen pass-through rates over time. We'd been hearing that there was some resistance to putting some of these new folks into the field, and we wanted to see if that bore out in the data. And sure enough, in Q4, we saw that the number of hiring manager screens per hire spiked from a pretty consistent range of about 4 to 6 to 15. So that's way too many. So that caused us to kind of go ask a bunch of questions, realign, and make sure that the business is putting the proper emphasis on hiring and that everybody's aligned on the need to hire. I think the last thing that we looked at that's a little bit non-traditional was rec availability. So I mentioned, I think this is particularly a challenge for field recruiting because you have an individual head tied to an individual territory. It's really hard to hire ahead of attrition. In fact, I think it's actually an HR violation to hire ahead of attrition if somebody owns that territory and they haven't been put on a plan, et cetera. So we suspected that rec availability was one of the problems driving our underperformance. And so we mapped out all of our searches for the quarter. So if you can imagine like a timeline with 30 or 40 lines representing the duration of a search. And then we counted how many searches were active at a given time. And this turned out to be the main driver of the miss. There was a point in December, right at the end of the year. So again, the territory problem, we filled all of our new recs for the year. We're basically just waiting on attrition to show up at this point. And there was a couple weeks there where we had, I think, 9 recruiters working on just 7 recs. So that was kind of the aha moment and prompted us to implement a process now where we work really tightly with sales ops entering the quarter to figure out how many recs we're going to have open and how that compares to our target. And we actually open up recs in advance of the quarter.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So taking that whole journey into consideration, when you look back, how would you summarize like your main learning from that?
Yeah, so to figure out those 4 points, we had to look at 15 points.
Yeah.
So it's a nice, clean story once you kind of tailor it all together. But in reality, we were throwing spaghetti at the wall trying to figure out what the heck happened. So don't get discouraged if your first few attempts at probing the data don't yield results. Persistence pays off when it comes to looking at that stuff.
Great.
Very true.
I want to just prep anyone in the audience who may have a burning question to ask. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for about 10 minutes of general Q&A. So think about something that you would want to ask these data ops experts here. And my last question for you both would be, we talked a lot about the practices that you've used, the strategies you've used in terms of using data effectively. I have no shame in saying data a lot of times. What would you want to leave the audience with in terms of like a thing that they can implement today or like a key tactic that they should keep in mind, regardless of how familiar someone is in terms of handling data? So Nick, let's start with you.
As far as handling data, so when I think about the most effective thing that you could do for any of your recruiting teams, and this is, the number one goal here, right, is to hire qualified people, right, find the talent. And so when I think about that, the most effective thing that you can do is 1, build a process that is fair to to candidates, and 2 is actually work with companies to write better job descriptions. We use a company called Tap Recruit that helps us write job descriptions so people don't have to figure out what we mean. It makes it 1, searchable, but 2, also just easy to digest, and we're all on the same page.
Cool, awesome. And Shane, what about you?
Yeah, so I think the one practical tip I would leave with is start with your capacity modeling. If you get that right, everything else falls into place and you build credibility with the business. And then the second thing I would say more philosophically is it's really important, and Nick said this as well, it's really important to know that data is only half the story. And it's important when you start this journey with your recruiters, there are going to be a lot of recruiters who aren't comfortable using data. And they will have this fear that the data is going to override what they're saying and what they're communicating to their managers. So it's really important when you start getting really serious about your metrics to make sure the recruiters understand that this is a tool to augment what we're hearing on the ground. And this is a tool to help us listen to you where we need to. And I think that makes it a lot less intimidating to approach.
Awesome. Thank you.
1,000%.
Yes. Okay, does anyone here have any questions that they would like to ask? I see one hand raised very quickly. Do you mind introducing yourself and then asking your question?
Sure. My name is Danielle. I'm from San Francisco. Nick, I really enjoyed your discussion on capacity hiring where you were adding a point value to difficulty of a search. Question for you, were you able to actually extract and share the number of people? Like you mentioned it was 190 points, and then you're like, it's X amount of recruiters. What was X?
Like our actual data?
Like how many recruiters can handle how many points?
It's been a minute, but I actually want to say like per quarter was like 27 points. 27 sounds like the really familiar number.
Okay, cool, thanks.
I would also imagine that the way that you rank the points had different factors that took different things into consideration as well.
I was working on building a calculator for this, and I think this is actually a really good example where you can get really in the weeds with something. And I was working on a calculator, it took me like a month, and then I just decided to scratch it because the thing that I discovered naturally was humans are really good at self-calibrating. And so at this time, we only had 20 recruiters when I was doing the point system. And so when I went to them, they were all some of the recruiters worked on very junior levels and only junior levels, and then some worked on really senior levels and only senior. And so they were just kind of actually naturally self-calibrating each other. And I realized that based on the roles that are open, those points actually just naturally fell together. So I didn't need a calculator for the time that we were doing this.
Cool, cool. I see several hands back there. And we'll make sure we have a mic this time.
Hi. Working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Lisa. I work at Pendo. We're a mid to late stage tech startup. And one thing that I thought was really interesting is how you were talking about pass-through. We talk about them as conversion rates and how they vary across different departments and orgs. For folks that are sort of earlier in this process, is there a general benchmark that we should be striving for, is the first part of my question. And then the second part is that conversion rate the same at every stage? So, suppose it's a 50% rate from recruiter phone screen to hiring manager phone screen, then would you also expect a 50% from hiring manager to onsite?
I can take this one.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great question. Where I would start is not actually by setting a benchmark and trying to achieve it. I'd start by just monitoring where you're at today. So when I look at pass-through rates, I'm less concerned in what they are in terms of absolute numbers. I'm more concerned when I see a spike or a dip. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier about, I don't think there is a right answer for a hiring manager screen pass-through rate or a tech screen pass-through rate. Again, it really depends on your candidate pool and how many false positives and false negatives you're willing to tolerate.
Only thing to add to that is I think towards the end, you probably want to see a higher conversion, especially when you get to on-site to offer. By that, then you guys should be pretty well calibrated on what the candidate profile and expectations are.
Yeah, I second that, yeah.
Great. Okay, I want to make sure I don't ignore this side of the room as well. So maybe we can take a question right over here. If we can. Is there a mic available for this gentleman here? Right here, in the front. Thank you, Alex.
My name is Lokesh Mehta. I'm with Sysons, which is a BI company based in New York. I just want to get generally your thoughts on time to fill as a metric. I have my own views, but I'm curious to get your thoughts as well on that metric specifically, because I think a lot of business leaders tend to rely on that metric a lot, and I think it doesn't really always tell the full story behind the role.
I've got thoughts, but I'll let you go first.
Mine's pretty quick. So my company, we've been growing a lot. We're still, I think we're that seasoned startup vibe. I don't think we have our ducks in a row to actually be able to measure that effectively as a company. It's definitely on our roadmap, but as far as today, the role being open to close, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it is. I agree with that. So actually, a tactical greenhouse tip. It is really, really difficult to measure at least the first part of time to hire if you're using evergreen recs. So let's say you open one rec with 6 roles against it. How do you know, are you recruiting for all 6 in parallel, or is this in series? When do you start the clock? So one tip for you guys would be to encourage your teams to open up individual recs for every single role. That will help you in the long run to monitor your time to hire. And really don't have an excuse not to. You can copy from an existing rec, so it's pretty easy. To answer your question, though, I would say I look more at time and stage versus the entire length of the process, because I think time and stage is more actionable. So if I know that this search is taking 80 days and that one took 65, that tells me there's a problem. But if I don't know where that problem is, it's harder to go do something about it. If I know that It's actually was the hiring manager screen that's lagging 15 days longer than the previous search. That prompts me to go ask, what the heck's going on with this hiring manager's availability?
That's great. I'll also add some thoughts on what we do at Greenhouse. So we have key KPIs that we report on as a recruiting team each quarter. One of them is not time to fill, but days to offer. We do track time to fill because it's a useful number to know. But again, to Shane's point, for evergreen roles, it gets a little bit fuzzy. Or if you open a role and it's kind of like put on hold, but it's still open in Greenhouse, like that time is not really active recruiting time. So when I say we measure days to offer, what that means is it's not tied to the actual rec, it's tied to the individual moving through a process. So from the moment that someone applies to whether they get rejected or get an offer from Greenhouse, how many days is that? And do we see a spike? Do we see a dip? Are people moving efficiently? Again, to Shane's point, he focuses on time to stage, or time and stage. We take a similar approach and we take a little bit more of a granular look and focus on days to offer instead of time to fill. Thanks for that question. Maybe we have time for one more question. Okay, right over here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm from X, formerly known as Google X. A lot of the metrics and data, even the capacity modeling that you talked about, there's an assumption that this is primarily for external candidates. Do you have teams that specifically focus on internal mobility, or do you just allow internal mobility to skew the numbers?
That's a great question. So
Really good question.
we think about internal placements the same way we think about external placements. And the reason that we do that is in more than half the cases, when an internal candidate wins the offer, it's been an external search the whole time. So the level of effort for the recruiter to still open the search, still look externally, still talk to external candidates, but then at the end of the day, somebody internally takes that role, I want to recognize that as a sign. The piece I think most people miss is that if you're going to count the benefit of internal mobility like that, like the addition, you also have to factor into your capacity model the detriment of internal mobility. So in addition to talking about attrition, for people leaving the company, you have to also look at attrition for people leaving that group to go internally. So we've done the analysis. We know which groups, typically are takers of talent and givers of talent. And when we resource those groups, we will add recruiters to the ones who tend to give talent, and we know that the ones who tend to take talent, we have a little bit of buffer there.
Exact same.
Great question. We are at time, so again, I just want to wrap everything up. Those 45 minutes flew by. Thank you so much, both of you, for your insight. I'm just going to reiterate a few key takeaways that you're leaving me with. I loved the cruise ship analogy around those small changes that you start off with may not be noticeable immediately, but over time they can be quite significant. I loved your analogy around throwing spaghetti at a wall. I'm taking away analogies here. So even if using data feels like it's really hard or frustrating in the beginning, keep at it, and over time I think this story will become clearer. And the last thing is, data is only half the story. So thank you all for your attention today.
Thanks.
And enjoy the rest of Greenhouse Open.